Hello and welcome back to Prism&Co. My name is Colin, and on the docket today, an Oracle deck, specifically the Death Doula Oracle. It's Doula in Death, y'all, and this is a brand spanking new deck to the collection, and it was really poorly timed in my acquisition. It was days after I made my Oracle deck collection that this one arrived in the mail, and I was like, well, so be it. I should have remade the video, but I didn't. Here we go. Anyway, this deck I saw on Instagram, just a few cards, and it immediately caught my attention. Now, when I purchase decks, I'm very measured usually. I try and really take my time with them, really sift through do I want it, do I not? And on this one, I was I don't even know what. I was going to say crying child, but that isn't what I was like at all. I wanted it really bad. That's the sort of long and the short moral of the story, folks. It is photographic abstract. That's the best way that I can describe it. And I want to really examine in on the abstract part of this deck today. I want to kind of break down what makes it tick and also why I think it's so successful as a whole. Also, there's 1,000 police cars outside, so pardon that if you can hear the sirens. Now, this deck does not have any suits. It's just cards. Nothing's numbered. There's keywords. But I've broken the deck up into 7 suits and 2 extra cards that I couldn't fit anywhere else. So we're going to take a look at the deck suit by suit and kind of see what that suit has to offer. And then after that, we're going to take a look at how all those suits break all the rules and really blend together to form this really interesting, cohesive thing. All right, the Death Doula Oracle. Cue the intro. That really was a moment of my brain just being like, and we're done, and we're moving on. Now, the 7. Hold on. I was going to get into the suits, but before we get into the suits, let's just take a look at a card. Just one card. I just want to see it. The Death Doula Oracle is majority white on the background with 1 gold dot in the center and a gold line on the side. This gold line also carries through to the front of the card as well. It's very elegant. It's very beautiful. And I got to say, the finishes on the card and the gold foil are really, really nice. I'm not one to talk about guidebooks either, but I do want to just point out kind of a cool thing that this guidebook does. It's just a small little one, but mighty. The beginning talks about all the cards, and it gives you a sun, and then this whole little thing, and then it talks about the ritual or the meditation that goes along with this card. So it's kind of like a choose your own adventure almost. It points you to page 39. And at the back of the book here, rituals, practices, meditations. And there's a whole bunch of kind of card agnostic rituals and things to do. And some of them have plant recommendations or crystal recommendations. Some of them are just kind of in your own head and thinking about it. And I think it's really cool. It's a very clever way to kind of engage with the deck and do something a little different. It's not just giving you a card meeting, it's kind of giving you an activity. And other decks have done that too, but I think this does it in a very smart way, especially because it kind of gives you a catalog of the rituals in the back. So if you wanted to, you could pick and choose, but it gives curated recommendations. Very, very cool. Now, I was talking with the creator of this deck on Instagram as well, and I was asking about the name. I'm like, oh, so are you a death doula? And they said no. And I was kind of surprised. I was like, oh, I fully expected, them to be a death doula, but they described it so well, and I think it's really cool. They said, for those of you who don't know, I'm not super familiar with death doulas, but I'm a little bit familiar. It's someone to kind of come in at the end of your life to ease the process, to make you not feel afraid, to get you ready for it, to kind of meet death head on instead of being afraid from it and trying to run from it. And I think that's really cool. And they said the same thing. They're like, I think death doulas offer an incredible service to humanity. I think that, they do really important work. What I was going for here, though, speaking as the artist now, was that this deck is trying to guide you through the process of self, death, and rebirth in kind of a metaphorical sense. It feels very alchemical in some ways. It feels very metaphysical. And, these cards are designed to be confronting sometimes and also to be comforting sometimes. And that, I thought, was a very, very clever way to kind of tie the theme of Death Doula-ing into what the deck is. Now, we have growth here as a card. I just wanted to show you what one looks like. We haven't even looked at a card yet. This is one of our 2 outlier cards. I'm actually going to start with those 2 just to get them out of the way. I have growth and I have torpid here. And both of these cards, as we'll see as we go on, draw heavily from other things in the deck, but they really don't fit cleanly into a category, at least in my mind. This is one of the only cards that you can see a very prominent human figure on. And this card has elements from a lot of other cards, but just it doesn't really fit the mold. So we'll come back to these 2 at the end and kind of see where they might slot in. But the other suits that we'll be talking about today are color fields. We have like color washes, kind of. We have top-down scenes of the ground. We have cards highlighting the color red. We have cards highlighting the color blue. We have naturescapes. And what am I missing? Cards on black voids. So here's our very messy list of of suits here. I can see why the deck creator didn't choose these particular ones, but let's walk through it and kind of see where these go. And we're just going to pick that one. Let's start with cards that contain blue. I take it back. We're actually going to start with the color field cards. I actually just recorded a whole section on blue, and it's not the cleanest suit, so it's a weird space to start. This suit, however, has a very, very strong visual identity. This suit is all about, you guessed it, fields of color. Here we can see, most of the card is dominated by a single color and or like a gradient between some colors, and it just lets that breathe. I think these are so stunning. Sun, pleasure, formless. There's only 6 cards in this suit, but they have a very strong point of view, and each one feels very distinct. Even these 3 cards, which are all warm tones, these ones are basically all like golds and oranges. And still, we can see the light and the dark flipping between these 2. The light and the dark stay the same in this, but the placement of our kind of like fluctuation point is different. We have much darker darks and much brighter brights. The contrast is much higher in this than, say, this. So even though side by side they're both light on the top, dark on the bottom, warm hued cards, they still feel very different. And then you integrate different colors and some, extra shapes and things. It's really, really neat. Now, the thing that pushes all of this over the edge for me, and what I think is so cool, is that all of these are photographs. This is the kind of least recognizable suit, if you will, of photographs. We're going to see some very photographic kind of stuff as we go, but it's not just a single picture. These are all double and triple exposures. Now, if you're not familiar with that, you have to do this with a film camera. Well, I guess you could do this digitally too, but this was all done with a film camera. You take a picture, and normally the film automatically moves forward, so you kind of have one picture per square on your film. But in this case, our artist manually stopped the camera. They said, nope, I want to take another picture on this same piece of film. And then you expose again, or you take the picture. And you can do all sorts of tricks with, opening or closing the aperture or adjusting things to let more or less light in, because the more light you let in over time, the more kind of washed out and white the photograph is going to be. I don't exactly know how this was made, but, maybe this was darker at one point, but by letting more and more light in, it eventually turned white. Whereas a card like this, they were very careful to make sure that not a lot of light touched the bottom end of this image. It's a little hard to see, but on the bottom of the formless card, there's actually a chain link fence in white. It almost looks like the negative of a chain link fence. It's really cool. There's just a bar of it on the bottom. But that is a very common thing we'll see throughout this whole deck, are images being overlapped, and also the edges of the actual film catching on the final images. I think in this one as well, that might be some of the film on the bottom kind of burning and the chemicals exposing. It's really, really neat. These images were made using studio lights and glass and things like that, kind of layered up on top of each other. I imagine maybe projected on a wall or on the ground and then a photograph taken. But because it's all real, it's not digitally created, you get these beautiful little moments of like that dark and light line running through, or little specks on the cards. Just a little something extra to give your eye details to rest on. And for me, that is one of the most important things in abstract art. Abstract art is my favorite kind of art. It's the stuff I like to make, it's the stuff I like to look at, and I like having some negative space to let the eye rest. These are full of it, big, beautiful color fields. But then moments of interest, details and pockets of texture and composition that really draw your eye in. I think this might be it's one of my favorite suits. I think they're just so kind of dreamy and easy to get lost in. Or access the dark, excuse me. Like, I can easily imagine this card being very, very far away. This is the horizon line, and we're looking maybe into a dense atmospheric fog. This is the ground as it approaches us and the sky as it goes away. Or maybe this is very close. We're really zoomed in on the green line that separates, a dark and a light area of a box or something. We're zooming into like a macro level. It is not just a green line. It's not just a green color field. It allows your brain to sort of dance and play and fill in the gaps. And that filling in of the gaps, I find so fascinating. From here, we're going to move on to a similar suit that is just slightly different. Let's take a look. I forget what I called all these suits. Boom! The name is right up there. This suit is all about taking the idea of our first suit, of those color fields, and expanding a little bit. We're taking still a lot of the same color, but now we're kind of washing in and out. Here we see a leg and I think a bit of an ankle. On this one, we have some kind of like ground or some leaves or some dirt, maybe some kind of spilled water or something, but it all feels very washed out. It's very ethereal. It looks like we're looking through smoke or fog. This is definitely something that you get from exposing film multiple times. Light just pours in and leaks into all sorts of places. If you've ever seen old like projector footage or like 38 millimeter footage, a lot of times when the scene transitions, you'll see these like bright spots of light on the side. It's called light leaks. A lot of like editing software or even photo software tries to mimic that by putting these beautiful, bright, colorful splashes. That's just light burning the film and exposing it in weird ways. And it's very, very satisfying. Thrombosis. I think that some of the chain link fence that we saw on formlessness might actually be from thrombosis kind of bleeding over into the next image. At least it looks like it, or maybe it was a similar chain link fence. But here we see that idea of, these cards that could be in the last suit. They're definitely fields of color. They're definitely very eerie and schmeary, but we start to integrate even more pockets of this beautiful detail. Sometimes it's a little bit out of focus and it's hard to know exactly what's going on. Sometimes it's instantly recognizable, but it's so faded that it's a little hard to see. I'm actually going to shuffle these up and deal them out again just so we can see them in a different order. Oh, I think it's so cool. And even now, hopefully you can start to see that while all of these have a quality of kind of fadedness to them and, color washiness, they're not exactly the same. These two cards have a bar on the bottom, whereas some of the other cards, or these three cards, some of these other cards are very consistent all the way up and down. And those types of little idiosyncrasies are what are going to eventually start to tie the deck together. These things that are currently pulling the suits apart and making them barely hang on by a thread will, bleed over enough to create this really interesting homogeneous state. I can't wait to get to that, but let's move on to the next suit. Now, this next suit, the blue suit, is the one that I started with originally but decided to go back on because as you're looking at it, you can tell this suit is not nearly as consistent as the previous two that we've looked at. Those ones were instantly obvious to me. In fact, the color field suit, the first one, made me want to make this deck into suits. I'm like, oh, these cards are obviously a set. Let's see how many sets we can make. Sorry, I got all burpy for a second. And these ones, in their own way, were all outliers from other suits. And then I started realizing, oh, blue features really prominently in all of them. Now, I do want to call out this card for a second, True Will, because I saw this card and I was like, that is done in Photoshop. Like, look at it. It's clearly an image that's rotated 180 degrees. And I reached out to the artist again. I had to. I was like, hey, does this card contain some, post-processing, some Photoshop? And they said no. How this was done is they took a picture of the trees and they exposed it in such a way that the ground was very, very dark. So looking at this image, you can't really even see the ground. It kind of shows up almost as invisible because it's light going onto film that makes it expose and makes the image happen. Then they rotated the camera and took the picture again. And that is mind-blowing to me. The fact that you could get such an even image that is so beautifully reflected, like rotationally reflected, is just stellar. It is that kind of attention to detail that, makes cards like this, as I reach over, feel awesome to me. I could see someone critiquing this card saying, oh, it's very easy. Like, it's very simple. It didn't really take any work. But knowing that this kind of work was put into the deck, I know that just as much work was put into this. They had to lay out the lights. They had to very specifically, create the composition that they wanted. And that, I think, is also an important aspect of abstract art to me. It's got to have effort put in. I think a lot of us have walked into an art gallery, seen an abstract image, especially maybe in the modern section, and said, oh, I can do that. And there are some times that I agree with that and sometimes not. I think a lot of those are more complicated than they look. But seeing an image like this and being like, oh, I know exactly how they did that, and then talking to the artist and having my mind completely transformed and blown, that to me is like, wow, that's some craftsmanship put into this. Sorry to gush about True Will for a bit. I'm actually not that sorry. It's awesome. Let's take a look at a few of the other cards, though. We see here, this is very much like, I recorded the beginning of this a few times, so I'm sorry if I showed you this already, but we're going to go back to, where do these cards get off to? One of our cards that doesn't necessarily fit into a theme very well, growth. And you can see these cards have some similarities. They're a figure, kind of a full figure with another thing superimposed over the top of it. However, this has enough kind of small, gritty detail that it feels more abstract on the whole. It's a little bit harder to tell exactly what's going on. It feels like bubbles or the ground. Or at least my perception kind of shifts as it goes back and forth. I also like that we're getting elements reintroduced here. We can see a chain link fence, but this is a very different vantage point than on the thrombosis card, which is just, dead on. Now we're seeing it at an angle. But we're also peering through a window. We're also getting the edge of the film. We're getting a light leak. All of these things, layers, layers, layers. And it's those layers that really create a complex, cool image. Here we have Angel of Incidents, and this feels very neat. It's like lasers. It's like blinds or the edges of glass. All these different things that add up to a cool composition, but are hard to sort of pin down on exactly what's going on. Let's take a look. I feel like we did not give a few of these cards enough life, or enough love. So there we have blue. Admittedly, not the tightest suit in the whole world, but I think still a very cool one. And this ends up being a very good bridge suit between the other ones. Now we're on to, what was this? Red stuff, red things happening. Oh, there is this quality of brilliant, fiery, overwhelming red in this deck that is just breathtaking in person. It looks good here. It is arresting in person. Now, some of these cards have more red than others, but all of these cards feature this beautiful, jaw-dropping red. Some have a little bit, just a kiss, a hue here and there, kind of a glow of red, and some of them, unprocessed, punch you in the face with it, and it's so cool. Now, you'll see as we move on, these are not the only cards that contain red, but these are the cards that have red as their kind of dominant feature that don't slot particularly well into another category. We'll see as we go. The lines are getting blurrier and blurrier between the suits, but it's still fun to kind of parse them out. I love sorting decks. Like, I could shuffle and sort cards all day, and I often do. I wanted to call out Truth as a really beautiful composition. I don't exactly know what's going on here, and I love that. I can identify this as probably wood, but I don't know how it's standing up and what these pillars are in the background. And we also have crystals kind of sitting on a surface on top of them. And, this is another example of double, triple exposures working really well, where you can't really tell where one photograph ends and the next one begins. And that makes such a cool, strong, abstract piece, because it's just peeling away that objectifying, like literally what the object is, and making it something that's just more about the composition, about the experience. The other reason I think this card is particularly strong is because it's one of the few cards in the deck that makes use of depth of field. We see some items are beautifully blurred in the background, and some are crisp and sharp. And that contrast makes for a really engaging composition. It draws your eye in. Even though you don't exactly know what you're looking at, it gives your eye a place to settle and be like, oh, details. I'm supposed to look at the details. But then you're also allowed to wander into the background and be like, but what's this golden haze? What's going on back there? I think it's so cool. And then this card, I think this is my favorite card in the deck. I keep coming back to it, Sensuality. Something about the two pillars on the outside, this beautiful swipe of this leopard print fabric, and then just this little bit of like rising, almost smoke-like fabric in the center. It feels like a high priestess card to me. It feels like we're looking at something sacred and framed. There's even light washing down from the top and these like stones or something falling. But then you take a step back and you're like, this is fabric. I'm just looking at black fabric and like leopard print, and it like sucks you out of the moment. But then your eye catches back in with this beautiful composition. It's constantly leading your eye around. The light and these stones are leading us here. And this is almost like an arrow pointing you down, which swoops you in to this beautiful area of red and white. And this white almost like activates the eye and starts to bubble up, and we follow the bubbles up to the top, which lead us back down. Your eye can rest in the center. There's no part of the composition that isn't actively leading you somewhere, and yet you're still able to rest on the individual elements so your eye doesn't feel tired. It is so strong the whole way around. This suit is very striking, and I'm going to say it a lot. It's one of the favorites in the deck. There's a lot of favorites. Can you tell I like it? This suit, natural stuff, nature stuff, there. This one is all about kind of like naturescapes with some extra stuff on top of them. Here we have the side of a mountain and a tree, but the film, thank you Colin, is blown away. A beautiful, almost waterfall of light in the middle of these rocks. I think it's kind of fun that Dishonesty is this like rock wall with something else happening on top of it. Like you want the composition to be one thing, but it's hard walling you and saying like, no, I'm something else. And then some images like this, which start off as one scene, this beautiful water and this tree, but then you realize you're actually looking at the negative space of a different image. They're very mind-bending. It's cool. Let's lay out a few more. Drift took me a little while. I'm like, is this just a picture of a field? But here it's very subtle. There's actually another picture of smoke that's layered on top of it. Totally gorgeous. Another card that uses depth of field in a beautiful way. I love the blurry cards in this deck. I think they're so cool. Cleanse, Balance, Surrender, Malleable. Oh man, the colors in this card, the way that the light peeks through these trees, so it looks like reflections on grease down here, and also light pouring through a forest as you go on top. That is a beautiful like liminal space between two images that just lets your mind go a little crazy. The Grove and Techno Cleanse. This is a suit that when I was looking through the images online and first got the deck in my hands, I was like, not really my favorite. But the like seeing them in person and really getting to experience like, oh, Drift is not just one thing. There's several things happening. Or realizing, how much the light plays with your eye once you really start to kind of unfocus your eyes in some way. They're awesome. They fit right in, and they feel very grounded and also very dreamy. And knowing that this deck is trying to kind of comfort you through like the death and rebirth process, it feels perfect. It gives you something very comfortable and healing like nature, and then says, but you're not going to be able to understand it. It's going to break your brain a little bit. It's going to play with your perception. And I think that's a perfect kind of razor's edge to balance and walk as you go through the process of what this deck is trying to do. I've done it with a couple suits before. Let's give it like a shuffle and one more just look through the cards. Oh, it's such a good one. Compassionate Memories. There's a few cards in this deck that every time they come up, man almighty, they are just so strong. All right, I'm saving my actual favorite for last. So now we are looking at, what is it? Stuff on Voids? Maybe. There's the name. This is all about stark black backgrounds with objects kind of floating in space. They don't feel grounded. It feels very much just like objects in the ether. Positioning is so freaking cool. This deck is so good. Okay, let's just take a look at all the cards here. Okay, I'm going to gush about positioning for a second. But one critique I have of this suit is that these 4 cards feel very samey to me. Like, they definitely have their differences, but it's all very similar looking flowers with usually one kind of bright spot of the same color or a very similar color. And that's not bad. You know, that provides some consistency. This was another thing right away that I'm like, ooh, that's a suit right there. But there isn't quite enough detail to carry these cards. That being said, there is enough that I like them. I don't think that they're, super weak or anything. They don't live up to some of the really cool, malleable compositions that we've seen in the other suits. Now, positioning. Negative space is something I was talking about earlier, and I think positioning does this gorgeously. Now, most people just like bones. It's a cool subject to have. We have a spine and some hip bones down here. We're already off to a great start. Normally, like every other deck in existence would just plop that right in the center, and it would look really cool. A centered composition like that is very strong. There's a reason that people like it. There's a reason that people use it. This deck chose to put that off to the side and then further highlight that it was off to the side by putting the brightest thing in the whole image, boom, just stark, right on top of it. Creating kind of this neat little X almost, really bringing your attention up into the corner, and it even kind of visually like quarantines you off and puts you there. Now there are these other light bars that peek in, giving us a little bit more kind of permission and room to let our eyes wander back out. But because this is the by far most interesting thing in the composition, the most detailed, the most intricate, and because we have this very bright object that will continue to take our eye, it gets us, boom, always back, always back, always back. And then if we ever let our eye kind of dance down in the negative space, it feels very vacuous. It feels very alone and dark. Our eye naturally wants to go back here, but the curiosity of just all this black is like, well, what's down there? What's going on? And then it almost feels safe to go back over here. And it's like, okay, I can always come back to the spine. I can come back to my line. And then you explore away a little bit again. It feels a little frightening. This is a very strong composition. This is a way to just offset something a little bit, give the eye some negative space, and all of a sudden your brain starts doing wild little tricks to move your eye around this canvas where there's really only one thing happening. Beautifully done. Let's take one more look at the cards. And like, okay, no shade at these cards, but compared to positioning, we just have some kind of, light things happening, some kind of grasses maybe over the top. Your eye wants to land on all these things, and it does move your eye around, but it doesn't feel like this beautifully constructed idea. And I think these aren't weak, but this is so strong that it just makes me yearn that these were maybe a little more different or had a little more detail or something. Anyway, I don't mean to speak too negatively. All in all, a very cool suit. And you might be thinking to yourself, wait a second, hold on. You showed us this card earlier. Why isn't this one in the stuff on a Black Void suit? And it just doesn't feel right. I don't know. It's black and white, and all these other ones have color in them. There is a lot of stuff happening which kind of implies a ground. And this is a beautiful moment of like, let's throw it in there, of starting to blend and blur the lines in a really cool way. The last suit, Stuff on the Ground, I think. There's the name. Here we have top-down shots of the ground with different items on them. It's often ash or sometimes snow. It's cool, though. Right away, you can start to see those visual themes of like, there's a huge bar of black on the ground. We've seen that before. I love this work card, by the way. That wire wrapped around that wrench feels very Jim Dine to me. It's one of my favorite artists. But here, we see this idea explored through several different lenses. We have a very bright, messy composition. We have dark, clean compositions with plenty of negative space. Oh, lower world. Oh, purple is not used enough, people. Use purple more. Beautiful fabric with sticks or bones and this gorgeous purple hue at the bottom. Some ash, some dirt. I love the cards with snow on them. They just look so interesting and different. We have some blur, some pull, almost these illuminated crystals that sit on top of them, some ash and some light that kind of peek in from the edges, and then a little bit of a combination of everything. These are interesting to me because they take the idea of a photograph, but they make them feel very much like a shadow box, because you could imagine all of these flat items just on the wall. Like, they're very much just flat. They're not trying to give you depth or anything. It's just like, let's look at these items, let's appreciate them for what they are. But then we're also going to make, these illuminated overlaps that kind of mess with your brain a little bit. I love shadow boxes. I love miniatures. I love tiny little ecosystems. So these cards really speak to me. I think that's why I like this one so much, because it really feels like a workshop, and like we're just getting this little teeny peek, and not only just a little peek, but like only that much of a peek, because there's not much happening down here. We're like opening a drawer and it's only like partway opened along the way. Very, very cool. So this is the overview of the deck. We've kind of seen all the cards, we've seen all the different areas and how all these cards are different from each other. Now I want to briefly talk about how all the cards are the same and why that makes this deck really, really interesting. So you found yourself in a reading using the Death Doula Oracle, and you're like, how am I going to take all these crazy, disparate things and make a cohesive reading out of them? Let me tell you, because it's not that hard. I'm going to do this in 2/3 card chunks and talk about how our different suits pull on different elements of each other in different ways. Here we have one of our void, suits, and one of the top down looking at the ground. Now, there are some really easy comparisons, like there are bright red elements in both of these. We have colors tying us in, even though this is focused mostly on negative space, and this has zero chill, no negative space in it at all. But even more subtly than that, there are some elements like the fire along the edge of this card, which can lead to the ash that we're seeing in Unprocessed. This is almost like a before and an after, or kind of like a looking back into the past, or maybe the future if the ashes are still hot, because we have this red. You can start to pull on elements from different suits and overlap them because there's so much visual consistency throughout the deck. One of my personal favorites, and one element that really attracted me to the deck, was being able to see the bars of the film on the bottoms or the tops of the cards. Here we have Moon and Manifest Self, one of our just color block cards, and then something with a lot more detail to it. But even though this is a photograph of rocks, it's or whatever it is, it's very interesting, it's very detailed, it's very specific, and this is just blank color space. Instantly your mind's like, oh, I see the visual link between these two. Maybe you've got another, random card in here. Let me just grab one off the top. Grace. Even Grace, you can start to pull in the color palettes of these two cards, and now we have a visual link between Manifest Self and Moon, and Manifest Self in Grace. These two cards are linked together in certain ways, and then these two cards are linked together in certain ways. So how does that inform your reading? How does Manifest Self in the Moon speak to something? Manifest Self in Grace speak to something? And how can this idea help bridge the gap between these two ideas that aren't touching? I literally grabbed this card at random, and it just flows because this whole deck does this. It's awesome. Here we have two cards that are visually kind of the same weight. They're both very busy. They both have a lot of contrast, lights and darks, and they both contain this blue. But here we have the blue kind of peeling in from the top and winding its way down. Here we have blue illuminating from the bottom and pushing its way there. We have the light of the sky on the bottom kind of creeping through the trees, or the light off the top bleeding into the composition. Both have pockets of white, both have blues, both have darks, and they look very similar, but they're doing very different things visually. Like, this almost makes more sense to flip this upside down. I feel like those look more like the same card now. And maybe you can use that. Maybe the idea of serenity is turned upside down to create a new narrative, however you want to read it. I called this out with work earlier, but it's got this bar on the bottom that was very similar to cards like the Shadow. So, again, we have a very simple card with a more complex card, but the idea of this bar at the bottom means something. Maybe they're both grounded. Maybe they're both weighted. Maybe, we're focusing on one half or the other, or maybe opposite halves. This one actually has the detail on the bottom as opposed to the top. Maybe this is kind of a yin-yang situation. There are lots of little visual ways to read into these because there are so many little bits and pieces of composition that are kind of mixed and matched throughout the deck. I've got a few more examples I want to show, but this card doesn't have a lot of the same visual language that the other deck does, or the other cards in the deck, I should say, which makes it a little bit hard to read. Because it's so different, it's hard to pull on some of those visual cues, and not that they're not there. There's always something that will tie them together, but that's one reason it was hard for me to throw this into a category, was that it really didn't fit anywhere. The other card that we saw, Torpid, I think it was, definitely has enough of the same visual language that it really fits quite well. All right, just a few more quickies. I called this one out earlier, but here we have the same chain link fence. Very hard to see, but it's down there, echoed in 3 different ways, tying all 3 of these very different cards together. Here we've got 2 extremely polar opposite cards of Icy Wisdom with Fiery Red Obsession, and yet the edges of these cards, even where they're touching in this case, share a kind of ashen log, that same texture going through. Maybe this could be a bridge that is bringing these 2 ideas together. How do you take wisdom and turn it into obsession? Like, how do you get obsessed with being wise? Or is there some wisdom to be found in something you're obsessed over? Or you can mix and match in different ways. I feel like I was going to say the same thing 4 times. Or maybe this really highlights how they're opposite. We have the same middle pillar, but now pushing us, really, identifying that these are different ideas that do contain some of the same core. People say all the time, like genius and insanity, they're the same sides on the end of a circle. Maybe wisdom and obsession could be the same in this deck for you. And last but not least, 2 cards that I gushed about because they are completely gorgeous. We have Lower World and we have Sensuality. Here we have, 2 cards that feature fabric on top, kind of stuff in the middle, and color on the bottom. Even though they're from 2 suits, 2 different sides of town, here they are really showing their similarities. Like, I grabbed these 2 out because of the fabric quality, but I'm realizing the compositions are very similar in some ways, and yet they feel completely different. The fabric is free-flowing and kind of wavy here. It's bunched and dense on this side. The purple feels calming and grounding. The red feels agitating and expanding. Lots of horizontal lines, lots of vertical lines. It's really cool. So even with all the similarities, there's still differences to be had. All right, we made it through the Death Doula Oracle, and hopefully all my gushing convinced you that this is abstract art done correctly. Not only is there loads and loads of work put into this deck, and I mean like capital W, work in the right way, but there's also beautiful compositions and colors and incredible design. loads of cool ideas, and all that on top of just a really fun concept. The idea that the deck itself is the Death Doula, and it is leading you through your own personal process of death and rebirth. It has been a real blast to talk about this. I just adore abstract art for this very reason. There's loads to talk about even without there being a specific figure or symbol or something to break down. It's this way to just dig into the capital A art of it all, you know? I just love it. Oh, we're just going to keep laying out a few cards as we talk. I don't even know if I have anything else to say. This was an impulse buy that really ended up landing in a beautiful, beautiful way. And I think the reason I was so drawn to it and so ready to just pull the trigger is because the art speaks for itself. It is a style that I love, that is executed beautifully, and to top it all off, there is a ton of cool ideas and work behind it. Okay, now I feel like I have officially gushed enough. Thank you so much for watching. I really, really hope you enjoyed, and I can't wait to see you next time. Have a good night, everybody. Bye-bye.